Então, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Vou falar em inglês, porque temos aqui uma audiência internacional, online e aqui presentes. Good afternoon, welcome all. Thank you for being here in this beautiful place. It's a shame people who are at home cannot see this room. It's really beautiful. Thank you so much for attending this meeting, this spring LABID talk. It's really an initiative from LABID, Laboratório de Ideias, from CICS.NOVA. This time is organized by the Urban Studies Knowledge Hub. We have, I want to welcome my colleagues that share with me this open session, let's say it. I begin to give a very warm welcome now officially to our guest, our keynote speaker, Professor Michele Lancione. I hope I say it correctly. It's my best Italian. From Turin, Italy, from the Politécnico of Turim, that kindly accepted our invitation to be here today with us. And I like also to thank my colleague, Rui Pedro Julião. It's the coordinator of LABID, Laboratório de Ideias, who organized this conference, and also thank my thank you to Patricia Pereira. She's my colleague on the board of CICS.NOVA, and she organized all these meetings. Thank you so much for doing it. The idea of these talks, this is the second one that we open to the community, because we had it already one on the fall in middle of December, and the idea is to let you know the initiatives and the activities of our knowledge hubs. We have 4 knowledge hubs that are kind of dynamic groups that can change according to the initiatives, the research activity that change a lot over time. And this knowledge hub, the urban studies, it's really one of the hubs more active in terms of CICS.NOVA. This implies to assume that this Laboratório de Ideias, LABID, it's a kind of interdisciplinary hub, because the idea has to do to the urgency of identifying areas of scientific innovation and teams of excellence, and make them visible, give them a public visibility, and develop these areas that we want really to have a social impact on society. So this is the idea of these talks, to show what these teams or what these hubs do. And I just want to finish, because we are here to listen, Michele, not me or Rui Pedro. I just finish with one small note. The idea is to share and to give visibility to these emergent scientific areas, in this case, the urban studies. And thank you very much again for attending. And now I hope you enjoy this session. And now I give the floor to my colleague, the coordinator of Laboratório de Ideias, Rui Pedro Julião.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, particularly to Michele Lancione. Welcome to our university. I would just like to express on behalf of the Dean of our faculty, welcome to all of you. Unfortunately, he was not able to be here this afternoon. He was supposed to be here. And he asked me to express this welcome and the thanks to Michele for his availability to be with us. And I think that, well, coming back to my role as a coordinator of the LABID, well, LABID is, like Elena expressed it, is a dynamic group. I would say that our main objective is to make positive turbulence in our research unit. So basically, that's what we are here for. It's to create turbulence from where there can emerge new ideas, new research opportunities, new partnerships. That's what we are trying to do in several, like I'm going to say, several research hubs, knowledge hubs, which are thematic areas that are relevant for society, thematic areas that we are, where we have a certain level of expertise and where we can make the difference. That's what we're trying to do at LABID. So it's a small group of 7-8 people, that 7-8 researchers from CICS.NOVA, that we discuss frequently what are the initiatives that we should promote to encourage these new ideas. So that's, and sometimes it's just to test if it is or not a real opportunity. And or in other cases, like another situation like this one, where like Elena said, it was the knowledge of urban studies knowledge hub, and Patricia, that I would really want to thank you for all the effort that you have put into this LABID talk, which is our, let's say, public happening twice a year. The first one was Katerina, it was regarding so COVID-19 studies. So it's another knowledge hub that we hopefully wanted to extinguish, but it's becoming really difficult to extinguish COVID-19 as a research subject. But basically, we are here to discuss new ideas regarding urban studies. And Michele Lancione, that accepted our invitation, so he kindly accepted the invitation to be here, wants to, we are here to listen to him regarding a theme that is very interesting, inhabiting these positions in the post-socialist city, race, class, and the plan in Bucharest, Romania. This is one of your study fields. So Michele is a full professor in of geography. It's good because I'm a geographer also. Marlene is also a geographer, and at the Politécnico of Turim. And he's also visiting professor at urban studies at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. So he has a long CV, and some highlights will be that he is co-founder and editor of Radical Housing Journal and corresponding editor at International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. His work focuses on radical forms of inhabitation and housing struggles through a 5-year ERC project. This is very interesting, and of course, it's acknowledge of your research from the European Research Council. Together with Abdul Malik Simon, I hope I pronounced it right the name. He was founder and co-directs the New Beyond Inhabitation, which is a collective study lab, well, let's say LABID, regarding inhabitation, collective inhabitation. So it's, and this is what Michele is here to present us, and we are going to listen to you very, very carefully and pay a lot of attention. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And thank you so much for your generous introduction, for having me, for inviting me in the first place. I would like to thank you, Patricia, for all the organization, and obviously all the colleagues at CICS.NOVA for having me and for providing the space. Before the talk, I would just like to share with you about the lab that was just very kindly mentioned. So this lab is called Beyond Inhabitation, and it's essentially the umbrella of the projects that I'm doing for the European Research Council on inhabiting radical housing. Now, the project is about trying to understand how communities worldwide are fighting against housing precarity, and while doing so, most often than not, they intersect wider forms of injustice. And what I want to show, can I just thank you. I would just like to show you a little bit about the lab. The reason why I'm doing it is because I was talking before with my colleagues here, and there is the potential of creating connections between what we are doing in Turin and what some of you are doing here in Lisbon. So the lab, as I said, is co-directed by myself and Abdulmalik Simon, but actually I cannot scroll down. Okay. So I just want to say briefly that we have a team of international researchers that are working in different contexts worldwide to look at housing struggles. So we are covering cities in Brazil, in Italy, Nigeria, Romania, India, and the US, and so on and so forth. We have a very powerful, I think, international steering committee made of what I think are 10 among the most interesting voices in urban and housing studies. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is because the lab, as you can see on our website, if you click on About, will provide a number of events and engagement opportunities, including a visiting program for activists and researchers, and also a series of international talks and events. So if you're interested in connecting around themes of housing precarity, housing struggles, this is a new place, and we would very much love to hear from you. And the other thing I wanted to share very briefly, it's another opportunity for engagement, which is the Radical Housing Journal. I don't know if you ever heard about this, but Radical Housing Journal is again a collective of about 15 people. It was formed around 6 years ago, and it's an open source journal. The peer review, it is peer reviewed. We published until now 6 issues. We are coming out with a new issue in July. And we publish essentially around issues of housing precarity, housing struggle, intersectional takes on housing from many different contexts in the world. One thing that we do is a section called Conversations, in which we engage with situated forms of dialogues with activists based in many different contexts worldwide. For instance, in the penultimate issue, we had 6 conversations around housing and COVID, just to bring it back to what we just heard. And we covered activists in Manila, in Jakarta, in Argentina, Lebanon, Nigeria, and Brazil. Again, this is a journal that is open for submissions. If you have any research that you would like to share with us, we are getting those numbers. We are not indexed because we don't want to be indexed, but it's a serious, so to speak, academic enterprise. So again, I wanted to start the talk in a little bit of an unusual way. The reason why I wanted to come here today is to establish links with what you do. And that, from what I sense, is also the reason why you wanted me here. So these are 2 possibilities. One is the lab and the other is the journal. And this is why I'm starting with these today. And obviously, if you have questions, I can come back to these later. Now, what I'm doing today is to present around a research that I have done and I'm still doing in Bucharest, in Romania, and in the post-socialist context at large, around issues of, again, housing precarity, homelessness, housing struggles. The reason why I decided to present this work today is because I am currently writing a monograph on Bucharest after 6 years of engagement. And so I very much like to receive feedback on what you hear today. Unfortunately, I have spent 15 years of my life working in the UK. So that context changed my way of presenting. I cannot do the Italian way anymore. I can only do the UK way, which means I'm gonna read what I have to present. And that's it. It's just a consequence of having been a migrant for a very long time. Okay, so the talk is about inhabiting dispossession in a post-socialist city, and it's very much a paper that tries to take seriously the issue of racialization at the intersection of housing with a community of Roma that are living in the southern periphery of Bucharest in a place called Ferentari. So here I start. For the best part of 2015, I spent most of my mornings in an alea, which means street, called Livezilor in Bucharest. At the one end of that street was a shipping container which had been converted into an harm reduction center for intravenous drug users. It was called Caracuda. On the other side lay a number of nei familisti blocks, which are socialist units that were designed as temporary accommodation for the nuclear families of workers who migrated to the city to work in nearby factories in the 60s and 70s. Over succeeding decades, these blocks had turned into what the media called a ghetto de miserie saracie scivoli, which means a wrecked urban periphery filled with poor Roma people and outdoor drug consumption. Raluca, the woman I would like you to meet for a few seconds, was living in and out these blocks. I first met Raluca on a journey throughout the inner and outer spaces of Ferentari, the neighborhood in the southwest of Bucharest where Alea Livezilor is located. Bogdan, a friend and a peer educator in Caracuda, used to walk with me around the neighborhood, telling me its stories and the stories of its inhabitants. To paraphrase Abdulmalik Simon, these were storylines about who was buying what from whom and under what circumstances. That day, we were walking by the pipes of the tele-heating system, which are the ones you see here. These huge pipes, 1.5 meters in diameter, form one of the unofficial outer borders of Ferentari. Though they ran underground through much of the city, in Ferentari they emerged for about a kilometer, a huge concrete-clad infrastructure about 2 meters above the earth. On our left was the remnant of an abandoned Fabbrica dei Macchini, which is car factory. On the right, an area of urban scrub full with litter. And in between the pillars holding up the pipes were dozens of tents benefiting from the heat emanating from the pipes above them. A few dozen meters in front of us, a woman was sitting on the curb. She was thin, short, and she clutched a mobile phone with a long trick attached to it. She was wearing a black perforated blouse on top of a short pink skirt. We were smoking, and before she could finish asking us for a cigarette, Bogdan was giving her a light. He asked if she was okay, if she had condoms, if the streets were calm, short pointed questions to which she replied with short pointed answers. She looked at me, but we did not speak. When we were out of earshot, Bogdan told me about sex work in the area and about how women like Raluca there suffered a threefold burden. They were addicted to legale, methadone, they were sex workers, and they were Roma. The only other time I met Raluca was 1 or 2 weeks after this episode. That morning, I was in Ferentari alone, talking to the people I knew in the area. When I reached the drug harm reduction center, neither Bogdan nor the doctor were there yet. The only one there was Raluca, waiting just a few meters away, squatting on the ground near the fence that separated the sidewalk from the small public park behind the center. That was the first time I saw her in Caracuda, and I knew she wasn't a client of the drug program. She must have obtained her syringes and condoms elsewhere. I approached her and I asked, "Ce faci aici?" And she said, which means, "What are you doing here?" She raised her head slowly and said softly, "Sunt rau, I'm feeling bad." The violent history of dispossession and racialization of the Roma in Bucharest was exacerbated by the opening of the Balkan route in the opioid trades after 1989. Dealers initially gave away the drugs for free, seeding the market, especially in neighborhoods such as Ferentari that were close to the edge of the city and already left at their own device. That was how Raluca and many other women and men got hooked with heroin in Ferentari and across other areas of the city too. But something more was wrong with her that morning. She was cradling her left hand, and when I asked why she wasn't feeling well, she showed me a swollen, tooth-sitting index finger. She was clearly in pain, barely able to talk or stand. And so we waited there, freezing, until Bogdan and the doctor came. She was medicated, cared for with the poor tool they had to hand, while they urged her to visit her hospital immediately. She walked away, holding her left hand with her right, a lighted cigarette firmly stuck in between her pinky and ring fingers. But Raluca never went to the hospital. A few days later, one of Karakuda's users told us that she had been found dead under the main staircase of the Nei Familisti unit, where she used to sleep from time to time. The type of infection that probably killed her is common among users in Bucharest because, as I was able to investigate in my fieldwork, of the poor quality syringes offered by the National Drug Agency at the time. They are unsuitable for the type of injection that heroin use involves and tend to break under the skin. But Raluca couldn't have gone to the hospital even if she had wanted to. She had no medical insurance and very likely no ID either. So at the margins of history and of a city that did not have space for her, her life was crossed by intersecting forms of dispossession arising from the racialization of the Roma poor, the structural pitfall of the Romanian welfare regime, the lack of any form of public housing, the instantiation of a neoliberal ideology that blames systemic social problems on individuals' shortcomings, and a revanchist and violent approach towards drug users. And these are, of course, all matters that are not specific to Romania per se. However, Raluca was also emerging through other intersections. Not only she had desires, projects, and aspirations for herself and for her family she was providing for, all of which were shattered at her death, but she was also the product of our mundane economies of life in Ferentari and the producer, if you want, of similar everyday arrangements. And those arrangements, and this is my whole point here, go back into history and forefront in the future in ways that only an expansive and transversal approach to dispossession can appreciate. And so the paper that I am proposing to you intersects a long and well-established train of scholarship in urban studies concerned with how planning produces and reproduces social strata as spatial stratas and vice versa. The urban plan, so to speak, is an act of power, an act of ordering and producing the other, and this is no news, of course. But here is my question: where does the plan end in time and space in a context where very different administrative, ideological, and economic arrangements come to the fore with great power and urgency and are then scrapped away radically in the relatively short terms of less than a generation? To account for the power geometries, and just to open a bracket, obviously here I'm referring to the so-called transition between socialist and post-socialist times. To account for the power geometries of today's Bucharest, an expansive reading of how its urban developments and therefore its plans have been assembled through these fast-paced years is crucial and is very much needed. This is a matter of time because today's uneven makings needs to be situated at a minimum in the last 150 years of the city and the country. But it's also a matter of space, because that time has been assembled through a variegated set of institutional arrangements, ideologies, and political economies that have produced multiple forms and functions of the thing that we call urban and of its subjects. Here we are confronted with a city that moves from being an extension of the Ottoman Empire to national capital of the emergent nationalist and fascist for a good while Romania, to laboratory of socialist government and planning, to beacon of self-declared modern, dynamic, high-tech European state. This broadly brushed periodization corresponds to very different ideologies, political economies, and biopolitics of the urban. And obviously, one might say that this discontinuity and messiness is not a problem just posed by Bucharest. To encompass this problem, it would be enough to root the analysis in the available periodization structured around key codified events. So, for instance, we can talk about the end of the empire, the birth of the nation, the rise of communism, the transition, which allow the urban historian and critical analysis to situate and narrate the city's governance of different struggles and chants in the past few decades. Arguably, this is how much of the history of the so-called post-socialist cities and countries has been presented in urban studies, and beyond it, producing erasures that have affected how these cities are read and their status as the post-socialist other within the field of study. But what if one does not only wants, but needs, politically and scholarly so, to account for that which cuts across these times and space to productively endure, not as something emerging unscattered from history, but if you want, as a longer kind of genealogy, a transversal abstraction of a collective subject from and through history? What if the available periodization at the same time explain, but they also obscure, and need therefore to be integrated with more nuanced, if you want, processual takes on the makings and unmakings of an even urban development in the city? So, in other words, what about the ways in which land, titles, frameworks of negotiation, as well as embodied experiences have maintained an edge of continuity across the very discontinuous history of the city of Bucharest? In this particular work, in this particular exploration, if you want, I am inspired by the works of Romanian colleagues like Nico Vince, Liviu Calcea, Veda Popovici, Ioana Florea, Adrian Deanca, but also scholars like Ananya Roy, Agar Kotef, Judith Butler, and Athena Athanasiou, or US-based scholars looking at Romania like Erin McElroy, who are doing much to reframe the question of dispossession, not as an event, but as a foundational, ongoing, and always situated process of the contemporary urban condition. This is also what Abdulmalik Simon writes about when he questions prevailing notion of habitability and uninhabitability, in how Black urbanites across cities worldwide cuts through prevailing definitions of both as a way to redoing inhabitation, and therefore of resisting and not simply enduring or being resilient to dispossession. So when it comes to my investigation in Bucharest, I want to all together, so to speak, and expand on these concerns. The first, a concern attentive to the peculiarity of local histories, and the second is a focus on the making of structural violence. And then there is a third on how the previous two are inhabited and rearranged from the ground. That's why I started with Raluca. Such an effort requires reconsideration of some of the available conceptual tools. Most notably in the context of post-socialist cities, one needs to expand on racial capitalism, okay, which is a very important grammar to understand dispossession. One needs to expand on racial capitalism in order to unpack the dynamics of dispossession of the Roma in Bucharest at times in which anti-capitalism was not only an intention, but a state and a social project. So what I'm trying to say here is that in order to understand this context in Bucharest, we cannot simply import the available grammar that is coming out of critical race studies from the US. So on the light of these intentions, I choose to speak of dispossession in Bucharest to propose three moves. The first is to embrace in the conceptual grammar itself the now established ideas that dispossession is the core of possession itself, and therefore also to indicate that the counter-political move needs to break through that couplet. So dispossession and possession are not a binary. Dispossession is the underlying diagram of possession. Second, and related to this, as a way to signal that planning and dispossession are not, that planning and dispossession are not the same thing. Planning can be as dispossession, but also as something else. The endurance of its becoming as dispossession through the discontinuous times I have described, lies in its alignment to the liberal project Atanasio and Butler have lucidly critiqued, but at the end of it, we can have a different plan. And I'm going to say something about this towards the end of my talk. Third point, I want to recenter planning. This is why this is an urban studies kind of talk, and the plan as a wider form of cartography or relational becoming that encompasses the remit of what the state and market agents do when they do urban, regional, and and national planning. So planning here in my talk is not simply the project. It is a cartography of bodies, affects, and politics that are explicitly or even implicitly all together in a sense of direction, in a becoming. In other words, dispossession, racialized dispossession, of course, can form even in those cases in which inclusion and not punishment is the main goal of states' agencies. So I understand the issue of racial dispossession in the socialist and post-socialist cities as a diagram transcending contemporary capitalism in Bucharest to define a much deeper logic of dwelling in and therefore producing the city and its subjects. Once again, the planning in this conceptual grammar is not only what is done by those holding power, but the assemblage of effective and political economies that, aligned in a certain way, diagrammed in a certain manner, allow for a particular affirmation of life in habitation to perdure and to reproduce through time and space. That is the plan, is what is all together through time and space. The plan is therefore an iterative collective baseline, if you want, that includes the formality of state and urban planning, but also other kind of intersections that are sometimes only interstitial or untouched by the formal urban plan, and yet concur with it to the formation of space and experiences. Now, this is all very conceptual, but in a moment, I'm going to grind it down and to hopefully make it clearer for you. So in a sense, I understand the plan by its sense of direction, not by its declaration. Following Tatyar, planning becomes the only partially formed and formalized arrangement through which contemporary contradiction, and here I'm quoting, between state and capital, nation and state, are resolved, put to use, and toward hands that only exacerbate the inequalities of our time. So my thesis here is that Bucharest's contemporary urban contradiction, such as overpopulations, urban growth, management of social inequalities, city identity, and ideas of futurity, have been resolved through a number of discontinuous, yet at the same time very continuous takes on the racialized Roma other. These planned resolutions are often unspoken, unannounced, and sometimes not really planned for, and yet they are always there, producing years of racial violence in Bucharest, embodied in the everyday city life across time and space. Okay, so I cannot really present the material I'm working on because, as I said, this is a book project in which I'm bringing together 3 different cases in Bucharest, okay? And I'm just focusing for you on one of these cases in Ferentari, where Raluca was based. So in Ferentari, my starting point are the blocks where Raluca grew up and ended up dying. This is an example of these blocks. These blocks don't come from nowhere, of course, but are inscribed in a particular urban form that Ferentari took since its inception as an agricultural becoming industrial empty land in the later 19th century. In short, up to the end of the Second World War, the neighborhood was a mix of empty plots, low-tech industries, and low-rise buildings constructed, as Dominique Teodorescu recalls, in the Mahala countryside style. To some extent, it was the least urbanized area of Bucharest, while expressing a lot of potential in terms of expansion, both for industries and residential, and it remained so up to the end of World War II. From that moment on, Bucharest's populations increased steadily, essentially people moving from the impoverished countryside, looking for work and better life in the city. Indeed, Bucharest's population grew from around 1 million in 1944 to 1.4 in 1966 to 1.8 in 1977. So it essentially doubled in 30 years. At that point, after World War II, and when the population was growing, the Socialist Republic of Romania was faced with the task of resolving, to use Tadiar's words, the intersection of a newly booming industrial sector of its population and of the urbanization needs of the latter. Housing for all was a key precept of the ideology of the time. But such a precept did not instantiate itself on a vacuum. Rather, it intersects a precedent history of social and racial segmentation with which the new republic had an ambiguous relationship with. As I have illustrated in some other papers, the communist state did not have a clear policy on what they called gypsies, which is a very derogative term, for many years. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, this population was not even counted as part of the country's official recognized minorities, albeit being the largest one. The approach taken by the authorities was to consider Roma workers like every other, including them in the working class, albeit that they mostly undertook low-skilled jobs. And this is an important aspect of this story. While this might initially appear inclusive because they are brought into the workforce, it actually both resulted from and contributed to the inability and unwillingness of the authorities to tackle the ethnic question, the racialized stigmatization of certain groups, which remained very high during those years. So the first official study on Roma people was undertaken by the communist government between 1972 and 1974 in response to the rising demographic profile of the Roma in the country. A follow-up of that study represents the first explicit attempt by the Romanian Communist Party to integrate Roma people into society, though this started from the assumption that their lifestyles reflected, and here I'm quoting, backwardness and underdevelopment. So while during those years, the state improved, and this is a fact, living conditions for many Roma, for example, giving them access to pensions, waged labor, and schooling, the perception of them as an inferior social group remained unchallenged, having become ingrained thanks to the long history of violence tracing back to their enslavement in the country. So as Beck, an American anthropologist who used to work in Romania in the 1980s, states, and here I'm quoting, prisoners of war were gypsies, gypsies were slaves, slaves were degenerate and flawed. Once the notion of gypsies were less than human was accepted, the possibility that they were anything else, most certainly not contributing members of their society, was not possible. Now, what I want to do here with this piece of research is to expand on three baselines of dispossession in Bucharest. These baselines, with baselines, I understand those spatial-temporal moment in which a plan becomes a platform upon which a particular continuity of racialized dispossession is allowed to endure. So in a sense, the baseline is nothing more than a conceptual way to identify an analytic of plans. It does not mean to indicate a mastery detached from the situated makings of that plan. In other words, here my scope is not to find a singular agentic power allowing for the endurance and reproduction of systemic racism in Bucharest, but to show how a racialized logic perdures across time and space. Indicating such a cartography of power, on the other hand, does not mean to disperse responsibilities either. It is a way to avoid westernized readings of local histories with the clear scope of holding accountable those that have a quintessential responsibility in allowing for planned dispossession to perdure. In the conclusion, I will go back to the question of what kind of liberation might be possible when one embraces a disillusion and essentially pessimistic view on the capacity of state agency to deal with systemic racism. Now, the three baselines that I will look at are related. The first one to the planning of that specific neighborhood, Ferentari, The second one, to the transition moment in which that neighborhood becomes one of the biggest area of consumption of drugs in Bucharest and in Romania. And the third is a contemporary form of racial capitalism in that particular neighborhood. My intention here, once again, is to show how racialization is made possible through this very discontinuous time by these plans, these collective ways of thinking about inhabiting Ferencváros in Bucharest. So the first baseline has to do with the production of the blocks of Alea Livezilor, the ones Raluca was living in, the same ones today considered to be a ghetto by everyone I spoke to in Bucharest. The plan here is as close as it gets to the conventional meaning of the word planning. To appreciate this, I want to bring you to the Sedenței Comitetului Executiv al Comitatului Central al Partidului Comunist Românește, which means essentially the biggest, the most important meeting of the Romanian Communist Party on the 23 July 1968. The meeting started, and this comes out of archival research in Bucharest that I have done in Bucharest. The meeting started at 5 p.m. and the president of the meeting was, of course, Nicolae Ceausescu. The first ordine de zi, which is the most important topic to be discussed on the day, was essentially to discuss the new urban dwellings to be constructed by the state to accommodate the new workforce coming from the countryside, of which I have already said. Now, up to that point, the houses constructed by the state were organized in three main kinds of design according to different level of comforts. There was comfort 1, the most comfortable, and comfort 3, the less comfortable. The comfort was not only related to the space, one could have a 3-bedroom flat in comfort 3, but to the level of finishes and provided services. In this meeting, Ceausescu and his comrades are discussing a project advanced by the Comitetul de Stat pentru Construcție, Arhitectură și Sistematizare, which essentially has been told by Ceausescu himself to find a way to construct more houses with the same money allocated for the years 69 and 70. So the communist state is faced with the problem of the people coming into town. And it has this beautiful plot of land, Ferencváros, that is sitting there unused, but is also faced with another problem. The budget is not enough. So they are thinking about adjusting the level of comforts instead of raising the budget. The solution found by the architects is essentially to construct flats of lower comforts. And this is actually very common in Eastern Europe. It's not just a Romanian solution. Introducing de facto 2 new lower level of comforts, level 4 and the garçonniere or studio flats, without kitchen and with a shared bathroom in the hallway. There are a number of very important things in this meeting. Some are very amusing. For instance, there is a point in which Ceausescu says that there are hotels for people that can pay $2, some hotels for people that can pay $10, and some other hotels for people that can pay $20, and the same should be applied to housing. But the most important things for the points I am trying to make are as follows. Ceausescu explicitly says that these new flats need to be constructed in periphery areas, okay? So it essentially says the garçonniere and the studio 4 flats are just going into area vor fi in zone marginale, outside. Second point, the group agrees that these new flats can be constructed in derogation to the usual planning scheme. Particularly, they can be without canalization and with fewer connections with bigger streets. This is another important point. They don't really try to connect these newly developed Comfort 4 and studio flats with the city. This comes back into history later. Third, Ceausescu is adamant that they need to stop building Comfort 4 housing, which won't be allocated anymore, but sold directly, and focus instead on the lower end of the spectrum. So no more bigger and beautiful houses, just the small ones. This particular discussion became law, and for a few years in Bucharest and other major Romanian cities, the state will purposely build houses for the new working class moving from the countryside, which is composed either by small poor family unit, for which they build comfort floor flats, or the so-called nei familisti, workers without families, for which the garçoniere, the studios, where also Raluca was living, are for. More than 60% of the total housing outputs of that period is for these kind of blocks. Now, what these blocks did at the time was to provide much needed houses to newly urbanized working class. But they also did something else. They explicitly segmented the division of class amongst the working class, allocating a particular set of benefits to those with higher expertise and status vis-a-vis lower provisionings for those filling the ranks of unskilled jobs, which were many in the relatively low-tech industries of the time. Given that flats were directly assigned by factories, this was the system in the socialist time, okay? It was not assigned by the state, but by the factory. I have found documents in which it's very clear the relationship between the kind of work task one performs and the kind of flat or comfort one is entitled to. And here comes my point. This segmentation does of course intersect with other forms of long-term discrimination, most evidently race. The newly urbanized Roma, often illiterate and poorly trained to work in the mechanized factories of the time, ended up receiving a disproportionate amount of lower quality dwellings, especially, of course, in the cases in which these dwellings were the major things on offer, such as Ferentari. Indeed, it was right at the edge of Ferentari in Rahova, where one of these dwellings, and this is exactly that one, was first piloted and constructed, bending the planning rules of the time. Sorry. Now, Aleali Vesilor, where Raluca was born and where Raluca died, was populated by buildings of these kinds, mostly garçoniere and comfort floor flats. Post-1989, some of these, and this is another important historic moment, were vacated by their occupants and some occupied by newly incoming population, once again mostly Roma, living in the impoverished countryside around the city, post-89. At that point in time, the Balkan route of opioids was opened, finding in these peripheral and transitional spaces the perfect ground for newly drug markets to flourish, met by the complete lack of expertise by authority and later on by open and blatant racism against the Saraci, the Roma poor, and their wretched lifestyle in the ghetto. Now, when one in a text like this one writes something like the Balkan route of opioids was opened straight after, a sentence like that makes sense only if that opening and passing through is brought back to the body, which is the place where I started. If it is brought back in conversation with the space and time I have just discussed. So the opening of a route is an opening of relations between economic interests, states, borders, control, but also with conditions of inhabitations and bodies and substances and flows. Such a cartography is not planned in the conventional sense of the word. There is no sedinza, no meeting of the Communist Party here, but the cartography is nonetheless designed, unraveled in its assemblage and brought to life. This is a cartography where the body does not have any pleasure anymore in injecting heroin, only pain and withdrawal. It's a plane the body tries to keep together with small tricks, dealings, and half-baked jobs with no entitlement to the studio flat it occupies, being constantly targeted as other and controlled violently when it passes the minimum allowed threshold of movement. Importantly, this is a storyline that does not have its own orientation and tries to construct and signal a different future for itself and for the ones it cares about. Nonetheless, the flow is constantly interrupted. by withdrawal, lack of support, jail, and other forms of embodied precarity. What you see here is the house of Marin, 26 years old, Roma man, father of one, drug users, hustler. We are speaking in one of the garçonniere, the studio flats, the flat of the lowest level of comfort I just described. I ask him, this is your room? And he says, yes, I live in rent. And who is the owner here, I ask? And he says to me, someone I don't know, because he comes only to collect money and then he leaves. I ask if he has a contract, and he says to me, it's just unwritten. And then I ask him, how's the life here? What are the conditions? He says, the condition, you can imagine how bad they are, because we don't have the basic utilities, especially since I have a 4-year-old child. They are unfavorable, these conditions. I ask him, what does it take? And he says that he takes heroin since he was 12 years old. And here I'm quoting, it's not about money, my problem, because since I'm a drug user, you can imagine that I don't care about that much about money in my drug user life. And he's serious here. You can't think of anything else when you get into this situation. You don't care about anything. You don't care about not being a normal person. And I ask him why. He says, because you are sick. You feel bad, you are shivering and vomiting. It's an ugly life. It's a nightmare from which you cannot wake up. I ask him, where do you shoot? He says, here. And this is the problem. By here, he said, right in the middle of the studio. It would be better to have specialized spaces, for instance, centers, to pay more attention to what we are doing. I wouldn't be forced anymore to shoot in front of my child, and this affects me a lot. I have friends visiting me. Sometimes I trick them. Sometimes I visit mom and steal from her anything that crosses my mind. Right now, I would do anything. I ask him, where did you live before coming here? And he says, I lived on the streets. My wife and the boy were living with my mother-in-law, but she didn't receive me also because I had caused lots of trouble. I stole them from them, etc. And I ask him if he has been in jail, and he says, yes, 2 years and 6 months for consumption and possession. How was life there, I ask him. He says, ugly, ugly, ugly. I take this chance to tell all drug users to stay away from jail because it's an ugly life there. He says, it's ugly because you're far away from your family, especially when you're feeling miserable and no one comes to see you because no one cares. You're simply all alone and no one sees you in that jail because you are not wanted. For instance, when I went to Botosciani, there were some days when I was smoking 3 times 1 cigarette, the same cigarette. And so finally I asked him, what do you think that institutions should do for you? Well, he says, they should create a center when we would be treated right, to have our own doctor to examine us so that we won't get sick so often, to prevent us from getting sick. You have seen it already. There are all sorts of diseases, HIV, hepatitis, you don't even know. I have lots of friends who died. In the last year since Legal Highs appeared, I think about 15, 20 persons died in my street alone. And I asked him, how do you feel right now? In my soul, how can I feel? You can imagine that I'm not feeling good because I have this boy and I don't have the possibility of staying out of sight to prevent him from seeing what I do. Because at some point he sees those things, and you know children these days, they are more curious, they are simply smart, and I don't want him to walk the same path I did. That's it. He restates, if we had a center where we could go and not forced to do it at home to prevent him from seeing those things, that would be okay. Now, why I'm telling you of this particular case, I have dozens of interviews like this, is because in order to understand the violence of opening that route in that place, the drug route, you need to go back to the body, you need to go back to the everyday of that experience. Because the opening of the Balkan route of the Piazza dei Droguri in Ferentari are not forms of state-driven racial banishment, or what Ananya Roy calls racial banishment. And yet, through its absence and factual enabling of drug flows, in the early 90s, the state provided the affective, cultural, and material infrastructure connecting, like a hinge if you want, a previous baseline to the next. In plain terms, the Piazza dei Droguri in Ferentari, the drug square in Ferentari, is racialized because it territorializes itself on racialized bodies, reproducing their possession through this possession, doing nothing to redesign what has come before, and therefore not breaking but reproducing racialized past makings. If the state plan here is to leave things to be and leave them to flow because it is convenient and easier to control a ghetto filled with poor Roma addict bodies rather than having the problem roaming around the city, at a more profound level, at the level that transversally connects history and spatial baselines, today's apparent lack of plans is a plan in itself, a form of governing, of reproducing and accelerating the abstraction of race and class through that particular block. The consequence of this is lived and felt trauma for many, but not only. It is the reaffirmation of a dispossessive logic through time and space, through mundane neglect, repressive violence, including the incarceration of the poor Roma drug addict, but also through the cyclical proposal of grand plans of humanitarian salvation, which don't go much further than European Union's-backed feel-good projects, readily touching the surface of these long-term racialized makings. So in a sense, enslavement, persecution, centralized planning segmenting the workforce on the basis of class while neglecting yet impacting on racial segmentation, as well as drug consumption, drug circulation, consumption, and dealing are not the same thing. They are very different things. But they are part of the way in which the unsettlements of this possession have cut through history in and through the blocks of Alea Livesilors and other margins of Bucharest as well. This broader choral, if you want, cartography of racialized lifelines is one that cannot be solved with incremental fixes and policy making, but requires a profound alternative plan for and with the city, for and with the collective subjects of its dispossessed bodies. And now, just to conclude towards the last part of my talk, it comes without saying that this is not the alternative plan, the direction in the making. Forged on the baselines I have showed thus far, the same old story has continued in the last 2 or 3 decades too. Bucharest has worked hard to clean itself up, to be ready for civilization, modernity, Europe, and now international investments and urban rebranding. This has included removing the only point of help for poor Roma drug users in Ferentari, the Karakuda Center that offered help to Raluca at the beginning of his talk, and that was actively trying to become the first consumption room in Bucharest as per Marine's wishes. That liberatory plan did not assemble the collectivity around itself. It did not fit with the new diagram, the new plan for possession, crafted by the local authorities and the city at large during these days. So let me just give you a final example of these formations of racialized dispossession. In 2019, the mayor of Sector 5, where Ferentari is located, presented at the MIMP, an international property event hosted Cannes, his plan for, I'm quoting, the best investment opportunity in Romania. The largest urban project developed in the last 30 years in Romania, 1.6 million square built area, 10,000 dwellings, 300,000 square meter of office space to be developed not far away from where Raluca used to live. This project, devised together with the World Bank, of course, sits within a broader envisioning of Ferentari, which include also an urban regeneration project devised in 2017 with the French embassy in Bucharest. I'm not going to unpack the geopolitics here, but it's very, very peculiar. For the most, this project of regeneration is about what to do with the Roma poor, and especially with the ghettos like Livesilor. Those, the ghettos, the plan says, are what is currently impeding for the full development of the neighborhood and the city. Curiously, the key area of intervention according to the plan has to do with viability and with the fact that most of the streets within the blocks are enclosed. angust, as they say, and not connected with other axes of traffic, a direct expression of the socialist plan, which built things in that way, a baseline or two ago. The recommendation, the way the plan uses to resolve, to use again Sadiar's term, this particular tension, is to expropriate, to demolish, and better connect those underdeveloped pockets with the rest of the city. Which blocks needs to be demolished is left untold, but all the arrows point in the direction of the Garçonniere built in the late 60s by the Ceausescu regime. We are talking about Marin's home and the plan for the future of his kid. The Roma currently living in places like Livezilor, Zabraiusti, Jakub Andrei will be displaced. Some of them are already displaced, but their displacement won't be other than the further instantiation of an ongoing set of unsettlements operated within the logic of planning through dispossession. And here I'm concluding. So in the context of post-socialist Bucharest, dispossession works through continuity and discontinuity. On the one hand, today plans for possession bear a striking discontinuity with those of recent past, both at the level of ideological framework, but also the level of their execution and of the kind of political economy they contribute to reproduce. So without doubts, there are essential and excruciating differences between a plan designed to house people, such as that brought to the fore by the socialist regime, and a plan explicitly designed to demolish, displace, and construct not for people but for profit. That difference is there and must not be flattened. At the same time, however, there is also continuity across these very different spaces and times. And that continuity resides in the kind of segmentation of social class and racial traits that these plans bring to the fore through their unfolding. So the problem here is not only of plans explicitly designed to exclude the Roma urban poor in Bucharest, but also of plans that without explicitly tackling the racialized baseline they install themselves upon, actively continue its makings. Enabling such a continuity is not a secondary or unwanted effect. It's a nuanced kind of enabling, yet of such a magnitude that neither the architects working with Ceausescu to the new urban plan of their times, nor the agencies that disregard the trafficking of substances and then repress the addicted, nor today accolades extracting value from land grabbing in Bucharest, can call themselves unaware of. So a transversal reading of what it means to inhabit foundational dispossession in such a cartography is a question of how to methodologically tap into complex localized histories that have been violently resolved by narco-traffic, urban land grab, and foreign development in ways that are systematically aligned and have therefore further reinforced the trauma of Roma racialization in Bucharest. Naturally, the state is nothing more than the temporary conjunction of interests around structures of power, allowing those interests to express their ends and meet them. And so it is just normal that the wider progressive civic society of the country and of Bucharest is busy in trying to find solutions within the state machine to fix the Roma question. The same civic society is the one that at large is conniving with the makings of racial capitalism in its high-tech assemblage and in the fold of foreign political influences and economic investments. Typical are the humanitarian projects sponsored by big Western corporations such as the Italian Enel to improve the condition of Roma in the country. But beyond the relatively adjustments that some of these conjurings can bring to the fore for selected individuals and parties, at large, the planned dispossession of the Roma in the country and in Europe, as for instance Giovanni Piquer has beautifully shown, continue factually undisturbed. And so if there is a futurity for that otherness, it cannot be within current state or European Union provisionings and diagrams. It is the state with its local and national agencies which has sung the song of dispossession again and again with its actuation that at times have taken the brutal form of racial punishment and at other times have fostered reproduction of social and class segmentation. As I've shown in some other works, the way forward is in empowering and liberating those forms of everyday resistance that are arising from the cracks of this particular history. As asphyxiating as it is, the cartography of dispossession sketched in this paper is not just a matter of being subject to. So to conclude, as Ananya Roy puts it, looking at the case of Chicago in the US, there is scope for the emergence of forms of dispossessed collectivism that fight the diagram of dispossession at its individualizing core, because that is the problem of the relationship between dispossession and possession, which is individualizing. In the entanglement of the dispossessive racialized cartographies outlined in the paper, which intersect with many other forms of structural violence too, the key question remains, and here I'm quoting Butler and Athanasiou: how are we to struggle for a desire to exist and to be free when this desire is not exactly ours, is not individualized, in fact, can never be exclusively ours? If our desire is mediated by the collective plans that we are unavoidably planned part of, the way forward is around the constitution of another way of planning, another way of becoming collective from the interstices of current makings. In Bucharest, there is important work done in this sense by a number of groups fighting for housing, for a radical take on Roma rights, and for a differential way of understanding inhabitation in the city. It suffices to say here that the task is obviously enormous, because the foundation of racialized dispossession are ingrained in modes of being and imagining the city in its everyday embodied life. A liberatory effort from that place will have to reckon from past continuities and break from how those have already diagrammed the future. As I said, this is part of a broader project which comprises a number of contributions which are already out. And what I'm trying to do here is to look at how racialized dispossession have worked in three very different cases in Bucharest. This case of the formalized planning of the southern periphery, the case of homeless people living underground the main train station of Bucharest, mostly Roma, and the case of Roma communities that are currently displaced from the city center. These are very different cases with very different histories, but they are united by this continuity across these continuous times of the making of the racial other. And the making of the racial other in Bucharest is foundational to the ways the city sees itself in the present. So this is, in a sense, the book I'm writing is, if you want, an alternative history of the city through the prisms of these racialized makings. That's it.
Thank you very much, Michele, for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I will now open the debate for those of us who are here in the room and also those who are seeing us online. So for the online forum, please, if you want to ask questions or make a comment, please just write something in the chat and I will give you the word. And for those of us here, if anyone has a comment or a question, please. So maybe I can start. Okay. So really, thank you for this. I know you are an academic, also a filmmaker. You showed us your film there in the last slides, and also an activist. And I was reading your paper and I was wondering, and listening to you now, I was wondering on your long-term affair, as you put it. It's kind of a methodological question with Bucharest. And could you talk to us a little bit more about your approach and this long-term, because there's this relation also about with time and space, right? The long-term history that you are telling us, and also your long-term affair with this city. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about it?
Thank you, Patricia. So I thank you for making me a filmmaker, but I wouldn't consider myself one. And I am an activist insofar as I enter a political space as Michele, not as an academic. And I want to highlight this. Academia, research and activism are not the same thing. They cannot be. Academia is a site of privilege and violence, and essentially in its relationship with activism is mostly extractive and colonial. But having said this does not mean that we cannot align our research purposes with contextual forms of struggle. And so the long-term engagement derives from the fact that I don't think, as a geographer / ethnographer, that I can say anything meaningful about any place, even my own town, without spending years looking at specific problems. For me, Bucharest is not a case study. It has never been a case study. I don't want to do case studies. I'm not interested in case studies. Because the relationship is frail and filled with danger. So if I have to say something meaningful about Roma people in Bucharest as a white Western European man, I need first to dig into the history. And that requires an enormous amount of time, especially because some of the history available in English has been written by Westerns. I need to dig into the local history. I need to dig into the archives. I need to spend time to build relationship of trusts that are meaningful for both parties involved, myself and whatever community I'm working with. And that requires time. It requires pure and simple time and energies. So yes, it started in 2014, but then it's continuing. This paper is just the last iteration of this long-term research. And I think it will end for me in the moment I'm able to create an argument that I think it could be of use for the people I worked with. And the film, in that sense, was part of that argument. At that point in time, that community in Vulturilor Street was evicted, and with other activists, we started to gather video material to represent the struggle that this community was facing. And then eventually, through a variety of engagements, it became a documentary, but only because it needed to be for that time in order to represent that particular history, not because I wanted to do a film. So for instance, now I was talking to my friend Simone before, I am faced with the challenge of starting a new research project. Now I have this big European Research Council project. I'm doing nothing with it. I'm just managing other people's research essentially. And that is a challenge because I would very much like to look at Italy now. I would very much like to look at the violence of the ways in which the state manages its asylum-seeking population at the intersection of housing. But I know that if I take this project on board, it will be a 10 years project, well beyond the grant I'm managing now, because that is the amount of time I need in order to make a little bit of sense of the issue. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's the methodological answer. I think the shortcut would be, you know, stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway says. That would be my answer.
Okay, so yeah, Simone, yes. Yes. So, no, it's just.
I think this will pick up your voice.
Go ahead.
Okay, I will project.
I think it's working.
Yeah. I'm not. Thanks, Michele. I have heard a shorter version of this. I liked the longer version. It really, I mean, it was a travel into Bucharest. So yeah, thanks. And I'm not getting into the issue of activism in academia. Maybe we'll talk about it tonight after you read the same title, which is later on. It's a discussion on civilization and how to struggle. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
But since you're saying you're thinking about starting the process, two ideas from that two possible dances to which this idea of continuity can also resonate. Because there are lenses to which I think we can see there in different parts. One is the idea of planning works there, you know, but there's another lens to which these continuities have been you know, looked at. It's the idea of the relation between urbanization and police, where police is understood its original meaning of, you know, the power of the state to do everything that is necessary to maintain the order, etc. Referring to people like Marcus Garber, but also Foucault, who has been writing and, well, speaking mostly in some of the lectures on how basically at the beginning police was the process of urbanizing. And so this may be another way, another type of genealogies to look at these continuities. And the other one is the work which I assume you know, by Cesare Di Antonio and Manuel Alves on the genealogies of neoliberal housing policies in Italian and Spanish fascist dictatorships, which they look at continuities more than discontinuities, at the way some of the central governmentalities, use it of the liberal policies are very much the same as those of the fascist periods. Yeah, I just wanted to share these two ideas that came in mind when we were dealing with this.
Thank you. I mean, I'll take it as a comment, but these are both very productive. Both, I'm not very familiar with the first, so I will look into it. I'm familiar with the second. I mean, I've read the work. I think it's an impressive work. Cesare and Manuel have done impressive work there. Yeah, I guess in the case of Bucharest, both things could work. I just landed on the plan, almost instrumentally, because once you encounter a socialist city that is planned, you know, in that specific way, but then the challenge becomes how you hold together that plan, which is a clear plan. You know, these people are meeting and saying, cutting the budget, build the same thing, just get rid of the kitchen and the toilet. How do you connect that with a moment in history that is apparently without any form of planning, which is the so-called transition, where indeed the plan is much more soft-spoken. It is spoken in Brussels. It is spoken in Germany, where they acquire land through the restitution mechanism. It is spoken in the legal trade of opioids. It becomes this kind of diffuse forms of planning around a space, not really about the space, which I know this means stretching the notion of planning a lot, but still for me maintains a form of a plan, you know, becomes this form of collective subject, a desire about Ferentari, of becoming essentially a ghetto that can be managed as such. And it also becomes from the legal trade a way of extracting value. So with this that you are proposing, I think, you know, I think these actually can flash light on aspects that my approach maybe does not flash enough light, you know, because I'm very much interested in the ways in which these different constituencies see an opportunity in that space. Maybe these are can flash some other aspects of this intricate story. Thank you for pointing at that. I mean,
really, it's a productive engagement. It's a wise engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Simon.
Do we have more questions from? No one online is no, so
I just want to say one final thing. I'm not sure who is sitting in the audience, obviously, because every time you go for a talk, you don't know how much people know about the literature and whatnot. But the starting point, which probably I should have made clearer at the beginning, is that in urban geography, in urban studies, in the past years, we have seen this very productive, amazingly productive engagement with critical race thinking, especially coming from the North American context, which essentially has really unpacked the complexity of how race and racialization processes are very much ingrained, assembled with the making of cities, the making of urbanity, and the making of accessory political economies, such as the one of the prison industry in the US. But that specific engagement with race has brought to the fore some notions that are not easily transitable, adaptable to the European context, and especially to the post-socialist context. So for instance, the notion of racial banishment, that is really key, and I've taken a lot from that notion from Anya Roy, cannot really be put at work in the case of the socialist state, that is not banishing, it's actually bringing people in. The notion of racial capitalism, which is quintessential to understand much of the contemporary urban studies debate in the US, does not really work in the socialist context. At the moment in time in which capitalism was not a project, it was a completely different project. But the key aspect here is to try to see how racialization maintained an edge of continuity and was reproduced. So that's why in the talk I experiment, so to speak, with different ways of tracing this continuity, because some of the available grammar, lexicons, if you want, is not really helpful in that context. That's the main idea behind this.
And thank you for doing this traveling of concepts and trying to also adapt them to different contexts. I don't know if anyone wants to, so I can maybe continue with one last question. Yes, it's really about something that it's very specific. So the people who are living now in this area that you talked about in the paper,
yeah.
And when this new plan of the mayor of Section 5 will be put into place, where are they going? And how is this plan to work out in the future?
Where are they going?
In the plan, of course.
In the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's very interesting because in the plan, for instance, in the plan devised by that mayor with the French embassy, there is written that people are going to be expropriated and given social housing. This is what they write in the plan. They mean public housing in that context. Yeah, but the problem is that how far along you need to go before you stop believing that shit. In a context in which public housing, it's 1% of the total housing stock. They won't be given any public housing. It's just a fact. They will not. Also because of the ways in which documents are forged. There is a huge mafia around this kind of developments. We just don't need to hide behind the finger. It's there. So maybe one family is going to be given a flat because they may be able to trace that they had right to stay in that particular studio flat across all this time. But for the vast majority of these families, as I said at the beginning with Raluca, they don't have IDs, they don't have documentations. Some of them have IDs, but they don't have documentation proving that they are entitled to the studio flat they are occupying. Partially because this is an outcome of the history I explained. It's also an outcome of the fact that this kind of racialized displacement are a matter of daily process. I mean, they happen every day. So what usually happens, where do they go? They end up living with relatives outside of Bucharest, in other marginal spaces of Bucharest. One of the quintessential problems of homelessness, so to speak, today in Bucharest is not rough sleeping, it's overcrowding. You have people living, 16 people in a flat that can accommodate 4. The community with which I had done the film, the Vulturilor community, on that day in September 2014, 100 people were evicted from that particular house, sets of houses, okay? Of that 100 people, at least 1/3 didn't have any paperwork to state that they had right to stay in that house because they arrived at Vulturilor coming from another eviction, from which they had rights, but they were never relocated by the state. So they ended up being with other families. Mm-hmm. So this is a process that reproduces marginality, that reproduces trauma, that disintegrates these communities. And most of them end up living outside of major Romanian cities. It's a fact, you can Google it, of these villages that seem stuck in the 17th century in the Romanian countryside, but then become colonized through European projects to develop, you know, whatever these places are. But these places are not underdeveloped. These places are the consequence of these processes of displacement and dispossession. So there is the active production of a geography there, which is a geography of violence, deeply ingrained with this kind of racialized histories.
Thank you. No, so can I just one last? Sorry. No, it says that it was not present in this talk that you gave us, but in the film, I thought it was quite present. Is the gender issue that you didn't develop here, but could you just say a few words about it? Because for me, it's very present in the film. I will put the film in the link to the film in the chat for those who want to, but I think it was very present and it was very interesting for me. I don't know if you developed more on that.
No, that's a good question. It also makes me go back to the methodological question. When I say that the methodology is longitudinal, is about staying with the trouble, I don't mean to say that I can describe everything and comprehend everything. Or I don't have that aim. I just have the aim of being situated in a place. So in this particular context, in Ferentari, my situatedness, my starting point was with the Caracuda Center, the Harm Reduction Center. For the vast majority, the clients, so to speak, of that center were male in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I was never able to encounter fully, albeit I had experience of encounter with sex workers, drug users, such as Raluca, but I wasn't never fully able to encounter the women at home that were caring for the kids, like the case of Marine is exemplary of. So here there is a clear methodological limitation, so to speak. My entry point gives me access to a set of issues, but I don't aim to speak about the other set of issues. In the case of Vulturilor, which is the one you are referring to, the documentary, the women took up the struggle for to fight for their dwellings, and partially they took up that struggle reproducing traditional patriarchal division of labor, because in a sense they are the ones caring for the home. The men were going out to work. Some of the women were also working, but for the most part, that huge presence of women in the struggle was also related to a traditional division of labor between the households. So their gender became more apparent, but again, it's related to the context. It's not because I choose it as a research question. It was simply there, and it became very evident, as I just said. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Michele. So I don't know if anyone has any comments or.
Thank you, all of you, for listening to me. I hope you found something in it. And as I said, you know, we have the lab, we have the journal. So if you want to connect, if you're doing research on housing or race and you want to connect, these are opportunities to do so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. And I think we can